how's everybody doing? I'm going to do the boring thing, the boring philosopher thing, and I'm just going to read the paper. So I apologize for that. All right, the title of the paper is Immanuel Kant on the Goodness of the Goodwill. All right, I'm going to try to talk about Immanuel Kant's conception of the goodwill without talking about the moral law. Right? It can come up in questions and answers, but I want to focus on the goodwill. So Kant starts the discussion of the groundwork for the metaphysical morals with the following quote. "It is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or indeed even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation, except a good will." Discussions about goodness can take us in a number of different directions, yielding insights into a plethora of good things. There's good art, good education, good legal statutes, good cuisine, and all sorts of good physical items. There are good gifts of nature, intelligence, wit, charms, etc. There are good character traits, courage, resoluteness, ambition, moderateness, and even temperament, perseverance, etc. And there are good gifts of fortune, power, riches, honor, health, etc. For Immanuel Kant, all of these may be good and are desirable for many purposes. Still, they are not unqualifiedly good. For the character traits and gifts of power or nature, just stated, can be made evil and require a good will for their goodness. One only need think of Professor Moriarty to see Kant's point. Moriarty possesses many character traits that we think of as good. He is resolute, quite ambitious, moderate, courageous, and even tempered. Moriarty possesses many gifts of nature and fortune. He is extraordinarily intelligent, rich, powerful, and seemingly healthy. However, given Moriarty's evil will, these traits and gifts become evil, taking the shape of his evil will. Let's back up a step. Two questions emerge, or seem to emerge, from the epigraph above. Namely, recall Kant's claim that it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or even beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation, except a good will. First, what exactly does Kant mean by a good will? If we are discussing goodness in Kant, and looking at his thinking on one thing that is good without limitation, then it would be nice to know what he means by it. And second, what does it mean for something to be good without limitation? Now, Kant is not explicit about what a good will is, just as he is not explicit about why we should believe that the good will is good without limitation. He begins section 1 of groundwork with this claim, as though it is a claim that would be accepted by any truly rational agent to whom it has been presented. He does tell us that a good will is character, and when defining a will later in groundwork, Kant states that the will is the capacity for action, and that a will that has rationality has the capacity to act from the representation of law, which is not dictated by laws of nature, but laws given by reason itself. Thus, a good will seems to be like something like a moral capacity for action, a capacity to act morally, or the possession of a moral character. And insofar as morality will be a purely rational exercise that is elucidated by the concept of duty, one should perhaps infer that a good will is the ability to reliably determine what duty requires and a steady commitment to perform actions from duty alone. We'll return to duty momentarily. For Kant, this good will, this moral character or capacity to act morally, is the only thing that is good without limitation. So again, what does it mean for something to be good without limitation? For Kant, goodness without limitation means that something is of absolute worth, and by this is meant something that may be regarded as a good or as a worth outweighing any other worth. The worth of the good will is greater than the worth of any other kind of thing. Thus, Kant considers the good will to be a good that is above all others, including the complete or the state of complete well-being and satisfaction with one's condition that Kant understands as happiness. But why? Certainly Aristotle gives us reasons for why happiness is the best or absolute good. for seemingly, happiness is both complete and self-sufficient. Happiness seems to be both the final end or the telos of human action, and happiness seems to encompass all other goods, and so requires nothing more to make it good or give it worth. To be clear, when Kant criticizes proponents of happiness, it is not at all clear that Kant understands happiness as a state of living and doing well, or eudaimonia, as Aristotle understood it. Instead, his criticism of proponents of happiness seem aimed at the Epicureans. By happiness, Kant means our well-being in general, conceived ideally as the maximum satisfaction as a whole of all our needs and desires as rational but finite beings, and our enjoyment of and contentment with such a life now and in the future, along with a reasonable confidence that it will continue. This sounds a bit more like the hedonistic view purported by Epicurus than Aristotle's eudaimonism. And thus, it is not at all clear that Kant's criticism of happiness as a lesser good than the goodwill is aimed at Aristotelian ethics, as many scholars have suggested. In fact, there are many scholars such as Stephen Engstrom and Julia Annas who think that Kant's and Aristotle's thinking on both happiness and moral character are not at all as distinct as they have been made out to be. What is clear is that Kant regards happiness as something of lesser worth than the goodwill, which he regards as the only thing of unqualified worth. Still, I want to say that there is some genuine disagreement between Kant and Aristotle. Kant's argument against happiness as the highest good, or as a higher good than the goodwill, rests in part on the propulsiveness of rationality, which, ironically, is the equivalent concept used by Aristotle to elucidate how humans live and do well. Kant tells us that, quote, in the natural constitution of an organized being, that is, one constituted propulsively for life, we assume as a principle that there will be found in it no instrument for some end other than what is also most appropriate to that end and best adapted to it, end quote. Nature provides beings with faculties conducive to particular ends for which each faculty exists. For Kant, in a being that has reason and a will, if the proper end of nature were its preservation, its welfare, in a word, its happiness, then nature would have hit a very bad arrangement in selecting the reason of the creature to carry out this purpose. So, we might think that the proper function of humans is rationality. Their rationality makes humans the kinds of beings that we are. However, for Kant, it cannot be the reason's purpose is to make us happy. And thus, it cannot be that the operation in accordance with the faculty that makes us the kind of being that we are, namely reason, makes us happy or allows us either to enjoy and be content with our lives or to live and do well. In relation to happiness, nature would have taken upon itself the choice not only of ends but also of means, and, with wise foresight, would have entrusted them both simply to instinct. In observing rational actors, Kant concludes that these actors are often less truly satisfied and secretly harbor a hatred of reason once they find that they have in fact only brought more trouble upon themselves instead of gaining happiness. And because of this, they finally envy rather than despise the more common run of people who are closer to the guidance of mere natural instinct and do not allow their reason much influence on their behavior. For Kant, reason has a far worthier purpose than mere happiness. Now, the propulsiveness of reason is practical. Nature has provided us with reason so as to influence the will, which is to say, to influence our actions. For Kant, quote, where nature has everywhere else gone to work propulsively in distributing its capacities, the true vocation of reason must be to produce a will that is good, not perhaps as a means to other purposes, but good in itself, for which reason was absolutely necessary, end quote. Nature has not given us reason to make us happy, but to make us moral. And we are not required to be moral because we want to be happy. Reason has been given to us in order to make us moral, irrespective of any desired happiness or happiness achieved. And this is Kant's real criticism of proponents of happiness and what he calls eudaimonism. The eudaimonist, in Kant's view, thinks that reason and therefore morality is in the service of happiness. Quote, a eudaimonist says, this delight, this happiness is really the motive for acting virtuously. The concept of duty does not determine his will directly. He is moved to do his duty not or only by means of the happiness he anticipates, end quote. Again, it is not clear that this is aimed at Aristotle, or if this is an accurate interpretation of eudaimonism, Stoicism is what I'm talking about. Aristotle, in Nicomachean Ethics, tells us that virtuous activity is to be performed for its own sake, or for the sake of the fine or noble, the cologne is what he says. And with this statement, Aristotle seems not to make virtuous activity, if it is equatable with or inclusive of moral activity, in the service of happiness. Virtuous activity is committed because of the kind of thing that it is, or for its own sake. However, if eudaimonists made morality serve happiness, then there is a true disagreement between it and Kant's view. For eudaimonists, in making morality serve happiness, would be making morality pathological and the result of what Kant calls the euthanasia, or the easy death of all morals. For Kant, like eudaimonists, it is clear that a state of contentment and peace of the soul is connected with moral activity. Further, like eudaimonists, happiness is necessarily the desire of the irrational but finite being, and thus it is an unavoidable determinant of its faculty of desire. However, unlike the eudaimonists, and this is Kant's point, the state of contentment and peace is properly understood as the result of morally praiseworthy action, not the motivation for it. So, for Kant, a sort of result that likens to what he considers happiness follows from moral activity. Thus, again, there is some connection between the goodwill and happiness. There is an additional connection to be made between the goodwill and happiness. Kant thinks that happiness should be given in proportion to moral goodness, in proportion to the possession of a goodwill. In a just world, she or he who possesses a goodwill is made happiness, and this is the highest good, where happiness is given in proportion to moral worthiness. This shows the true difference in the goodness of happiness versus the goodness of the goodwill. Happiness seems to be a good condition by or dependent on a goodwill. A goodwill is unconditionally good. Kant writes that, quote, in this case, it is entirely consistent with the wisdom of nature if we perceive that the cultivation of reason, which is requisite for the first, namely the goodwill, and unconditional purpose, again, namely goodwill, limits in many ways at this, or at least in this life, the attainment of the second, namely happiness, which is always conditional. We cultivate reason for the purpose of being moral, which conditions our fitness for happiness. Here again, Kant's point is that happiness seems to be a qualified good and one that is conditional. The goodwill seems to be unqualifiedly good and is unconditional. It and it alone is good without limitation. Now, what follows from the claim that the goodwill is good without limitation? Well, an idea that follows is that the goodwill's goodness is internal. So, if the goodwill is unqualifiedly good, then its goodness is internal. Its goodness does not depend on some other good thing. And if it is the case that the goodness does not depend on some other good thing, then it cannot be the case, or then it cannot be or become good because of what it affects or accomplishes. Thus, if the goodwill, as the capacity for moral activity or the possession of moral character, is unqualifiedly good and is what defines morality, then all consequentialist theories are false, given that consequentialism determines right action by the production of some good considered intrinsically good through actions, which is to say that it determines right action through consequences. Kant tells us that, quote, a good will is not good because of what it affects or accomplishes, nor because of its fitness to attain some proposed end, it is good only through its willing, i.e., it is good in itself, end quote. Certain products produced through our willing neither add to nor take away from our good will. This argument against consequences seems to run as follows. First, or premise one, the only thing of unqualified moral goodness is the good will. Premise two, if consequences make a will good, then the goodness of the good will is dependent on the goodness of the consequences. P3, if, however, consequences make the will good, then the good will is not unqualifiedly good. The good will is made good by the consequences. However, in contradiction to P1, this cannot be given the first premise. And so, if the good will is unqualifiedly good, which we know it to be, or which Kant claims it to be, then the good will cannot be good because of what it produces. The consequences of a good will matter nothing to the goodness of the will, and consequently matter nothing to morally praiseworthy action. So something that follows from the claim that the good will is good without limitation is that what the good will affects or accomplishes matters nothing to its goodness. In one of the more beautifully expressed passages in Groundwork, Kant tells us that, quote, even if this will should wholly lack the capacity to carry out its purpose, if with its greatest efforts it should yet achieve nothing, and only the good will were left, then, like a jewel, it would shine by itself as something that has its full worth in itself, end quote. In this way, we might conclude that what follows from the claim that the good will is unqualifiedly good is that an adequate moral theory cannot be consequentialist. What else follows from the claim that the good will is good without limitation? Let's say that we are convinced by Kant's claim that the goodness of the good will is internal. What does this tell us about the kind of motivation such a will can have? For Kant, deliberate human action either has reason as its source or is derived from some feeling or inclination, either directly or indirectly. Now, by feeling is meant a person's capacity to experience attraction and aversion, pleasure and pain, etc. And by inclination, Kant seems to mean that the satisfaction of a desire to either avoid pain or indulge in pleasure. For Kant, if we say that the goodness of the good will is internal, then we must say that the motivation for action for a good will cannot be a feeling or inclination, but that the good will must have reason as its source of motivation. Why? Well, Kant gives us at least two reasons. First, Kant reasons that if an action done from duty is action expressive of a good will, and hence is an action good in itself, then the goodness of the action can lie neither in the actual or intended effect. In this case, the action would be good as a means to the goodness of that effect. However, all actions undertaken from the purpose of fulfilling some desire, which is to say to satisfy an inclination, are good merely as a means to the end of that desire. Thus, the goodness of an action depends on the desire actually being fulfilled. And so, actions of a good will cannot be those undertaken for the purpose of fulfilling some desire. So, quote, the truth or the moral, quote, the moral worth of an action does not lie in the effect expected from it, nor in the principle of action that needs to borrow its motive from this expected effect, end quote. Consequences are the effects, and inclination borrows its motive from this expected effect. To restate this, motives from inclination borrow from the effect, the consequences, which we have already seen matter nothing to the goodness of the good will. Now, Kant's problem with feelings, namely sympathy, empathy, or what he calls pathological love, etc., which seems to be an implicit objection to moral sense theory, seems to be that they cannot be commanded from an obligation in a way that would confer a moral right, and thus cannot be binding. No one can be praised or blamed for not having certain feelings. So, let's say that one has an obligation to be beneficent. which Kant thinks that one does. This obligation cannot be grounded in pathological love or sympathy or empathy. In fact, the obligation cannot be grounded in any feeling. Kant thinks that, or Kant tells us that neither love nor sympathy can be commanded, and no one can be required to feel love for another. No one has a valid claim or right to be loved. So, if one has a moral obligation to beneficence, for Kant, one does have, for Kant, one does have a right to beneficence if it derives from reason, which will form the basis of the concept of respect and will be elucidated by duty. Thus, if beneficence is a moral obligation which gives people a moral right to it, then it derives from reason. So, if the goodness of the good will is internal, then the motivation for its operation, which is to say moral action, must derive from reason and reason alone. And Kant thinks that this is best elucidated by the concept of duty. Kant tells us that duty is the necessity of an action from respect for law. Here, we're talking about practical necessity and not natural necessity, which is to say that we're talking about self-constraint and not external constraint. And by law, Kant means a rational principle that is objectively valid for all rational beings. Thus, Kant thinks that in acting from duty, one immediately recognizes that something is required as a precept of reason, and that one must submit his or her will to it. Kant writes that, quote, what I recognize immediately as a law for me, I recognize with respect. And this means merely the consciousness of the subordination of my will to a law without the mediation of other influences upon my senses, end quote. Ultimately, what Kant seems to think is that one can only respect precepts of reason and can at best love objects that are the effects of actions. In closing, I don't want to give the impression that Kant abhors feelings or the emotions and requires that humans satisfy no desires. I know it's tempting to feel like that. Further, it is not the case that feelings are completely absent of morality. Actions done from certain emotions and inclinations are in conformity with duty, but not from duty, do deserve praise and encouragement. Further, in the metaphysics of morals, Kant seems to be aware that certain kinds of feelings and emotions, namely respect, which he'll call practical love of human beings, moral approval and disapproval, and conscience, are required in order for human beings to live rational lives. Still further, Kant thinks that we have a duty to cultivate certain of our natural emotions. Consider Kant here. Quote, sympathetic joy and sadness are sensible feelings of pleasure and displeasure at another state of joy or pain. Shared feelings, sympathetic feelings. Nature has already implanted in human beings receptivity to these feelings. But to use this as a means of promoting active and rational benevolence is still a particular, though only conditional duty. It is called the duty of humanity because a human being is regarded here not merely as a rational being, but also as an animal endowed with reason, end quote. As Nancy Sherman tells us, quote, Kant's claim is that the imperfect duty of benevolence, or practical benevolence, requires that as a derivative duty, the cultivation of our natural susceptibility to feel sympathetic joy and sorrow. Though we cannot be obligated to have these inclinations to the extent that we do already have them as part of our natural constitution, we are obligated to cultivate and manifest them in benevolent action. This is one reason why Kant suggests that we engage in activities such as visiting hospitals. This kind of activity allows us to cultivate a disposition to take an interest in others' welfare. So, to wrap up, what can be gained from Kant's claim that it is impossible to think of anything at all in the world, or anything beyond it, that could be considered good without limitation except a good will. Of greatest importance is the worth of possessing a rational nature, namely as it regards morally praiseworthy activity. Beyond this, if we buy Kant's claim, then we have reasons to doubt a great deal of theories related to morality, including consequentialist theories, hedonistic theories, utilitarianism by implication, moral sense theories, and perhaps even Aristotelian eudaimonism. Thank you.
All right, well, I'm really grateful to Brian for inviting me here today to talk about John Stuart Mill. As Brian no doubt knows, I don't generally need an invitation to start talking about my fondness for John Stuart Mill, but I'm nevertheless happy to have the excuse on this occasion. Part of my fondness for Mill, of course, derives from just the tremendous quality and sheer volume of his intellectual work. Mill's best known among philosophers for his work in moral theory as one of the founding figures of utilitarianism. But that's just a small part of what Mill did, although it would be a lifetime's accomplishment for most of us. Mill also was the author of A System of Logic, which was a tremendously influential text during the 19th century. His Principles of Political Economy was probably one of the top 3 or 4 influential works of political economy in the 19th century. And then, of course, there's the utilitarian stuff as well. But it's not just his intellectual work that makes me fond of Mill. He also lived just a remarkable life, which you could read about in his autobiography, which I recommend to everybody. It's really short and quite a beautiful piece of writing. Mill was a man who was, I think, literally born to be a philosopher. Mill's father, pictured on the left there, homely looking fellow, James Mill, was a fairly remarkable individual himself, noted historian, himself a significant economic theorist and a philosopher. And with Jeremy Bentham on the right, the elder Mill was part of a loosely organized group of individuals called the philosophical radicals. And these were it's important to understand the context because this is the intellectual environment in which Mill grew up, this philosophical radicalism. And what philosophical radicalism was first and foremost a movement of social reform. So Bentham was, yes, a philosopher, yes, a legal theorist, but first and foremost, somebody who wanted to change society for the better. Somebody who saw unjust social institutions and wanted to make them better, more equal, more free, more just than they were before. And that, Bentham was kind of the centerpiece of this movement, but Mill was greatly influenced by Bentham and wanted to do his part in contributing to that movement of social reform and saw in his firstborn child, John Stuart Mill, an opportunity to make just that contribution. So even before John Stuart Mill was born, James Mill saw the opportunity in this kid to be what I like to think of as a kind of utilitarian Jesus, right? So John Stuart Mill was going to be this person who was going to be, from the very beginning, just fed all the knowledge that his little 3-year-old mind could handle, and taught from a very early age the doctrines of utilitarianism so that one day he could grow up and preach this to the world and affect the kind of social change that James Mill and Jeremy Bentham envisioned. I won't go into detail, but the program of education that James Mill devised for his son to carry out this plan is one of the most remarkable things in the history of Western philosophy, as far as I'm concerned. So he was an educational theorist too, among all the other things he did. So he concocted this scheme where he would have John Stuart Mill read all these books, and then go for long walks with him, where he would talk about what he read the next day and ask him questions. So Mill, by the time he was 3, he was reading ancient Greek. By the time he was 8, he was reading the Platonic dialogues in Latin. Mill later remarked that the Theaetetus may have been a bit much for him at that age, but other than that, he came out of it mostly all right. There's a sad ending to that story, but I'll get to that later. So because of all that, you can't really understand Mill's theory of the good without understanding the Benthamite context in which he grew up. So a word about that. For our purposes, one of the most important things to recognize about Bentham's moral theory is a distinction between the concept of the right and the concept of the good. So right for utilitarians and its opposite wrong, right, these terms, are concepts about the permissibility or impermissibility of actions. So we might say that it's wrong to murder somebody, and what that means is that murder is an impermissible, a morally impermissible act to perform. Helping little old ladies across the street, that's right. That means it's a morally permissible action to perform. So right and wrong are concepts that apply to actions. Good and bad, in contrast, are concepts that apply to states of affairs, states of the world. So we might say health, for instance. Health is good, and what that means is that health is something to be desired, to be sought after, to be pursued or maintained once one has it. Pain, in contrast, is bad, and that means that pain is something to be avoided, right, not desired. So you put that distinction into practice, and you can really get a handle on the entire Benthamite system of philosophy fairly easily. So the Benthamite theory of the good is that pleasure is the only thing with intrinsic value. There are other things that have value, health, wealth, friendship, and achievement, for instance, but anything else that has value only has value either for the pleasure inherent in it or as a means to some further pleasure, right? So like, you're here getting a college education. Why is a college education important? Well, you might say it's important so that you can get a job. Why do you want a job? A job so you can make money. Why do you want money? So you can buy the things you want. Why do you want to buy the things you want? Ultimately, it's for pleasure, says Bentham. Everything you do is ultimately motivated by pleasure. Right action, in turn, what's the right thing to do in any given circumstance? Well, it's simply to produce as much good as possible, not just for yourself. Bentham was not an egoist. Bentham thought we should try to maximize pleasure globally, so produce as much pleasure, whether in oneself or in others, as possible. But it's a fairly straightforward relationship, right? The good is pleasure. The right thing to do is maximize the good, maximize pleasure. Okay, so there's a lot to say about that utilitarian theory of right action, consequentialism. I'm not going to do so, given the theme of this series. I'm going to focus on Mill's theory of the good instead. And that theory, the theory that pleasure is the only thing with intrinsic value, is known in philosophy as ethical hedonism. And it's important not to let that name fool you, because you know, you hear the word hedonism, certain associations jump to mind. Bentham is not saying that you should seek pleasure wantonly, right? So he's not endorsing a life of gluttony, a life of promiscuity, a life of drunkenness. Pleasure, Bentham thought, was something that we ought to pursue intelligently. It's something that requires us to take into account not just the effects on us, but the effects on other people as well. Not just the immediate effects, but the long-term effects as well. In fact, Bentham devised this whole system, this philosophic calculus, he called it, for figuring out what the effects of the various courses of action we had open to us would be on the net amount of pleasure in the world. And so he thought, like, we can categorize pleasures by these different characteristics. We can talk about the intensity of pleasures, like how much pleasure per second do you get from eating a chocolate cupcake, right? The duration of the pleasure, how long does that pleasure last? The certainty of it, how likely are you really to get pleasure from eating that cupcake? Maybe it's spoiled. Then we got these great words, propinquity and fecundity, which just have to do with the after effects of the pleasure, right? So yeah, you might get a lot of pleasure right now from, say, a night of just binge eating cupcakes, but the next morning you're going to feel a lot of pain as a result, and you have to balance those things out. Finally, extent is the number of people affected by the action. So you can actually, somebody on the internet did this, not me, I take no credit, in fact I don't even really understand this, but you could sort of work this out mathematically to calculate the utility effects of various courses of action, and then you're supposed to find the one that's going to produce the most happiness overall, and that's the thing to do. But it's all quantity, right? I mean, there are different characteristics by which pleasure can be measured, but really all there is pleasure. There's this simple object or simple experience for Bentham known as pleasure, and the idea is to get simply as much of that as possible. So it's a monistic theory of value. There's one intrinsic value, and all that there is to be deliberated about is the quantity of pleasure available to you. Okay, there's some problems with that theory, which I'll talk about in a little bit, and which Mill himself would come to later see. But before I do that, I wanted to say a few things about the advantages of this theory. One advantage is it's an elegantly reductionist theory of value, which is kind of nice in a scientific sense, right? So you look out in the world, and there appears to be this bewildering array of incommensurable values. I mean, there's friendship, there's career success, there's family, there's romantic love. And sometimes these things come into conflict with each other, and if they're just different, if they're just like fundamentally different kinds of goods, how do you choose, right? How do you choose when family and career come into conflict? Bentham tries to give us an answer to that question, or at least he tries to give us a way of approaching that question, right? By identifying a common unit of measurement that we can employ to assess all the different goods out there, right? This like inches with respect to height, pleasure is with respect to goods. We can use that unit of measurement to compare and assess and choose between these different goods available to us. It doesn't give us the answers. Sometimes there's going to be a lot of unanswerable questions about what would be the effects of leaving my job and starting another career. Right? I don't know. But it at least gives us a framework for approaching those questions. Bentham's theory is also a very flexible one. For much of the history of Western philosophy, there had been the idea in one shape or another that there's basically one kind of good life for everybody. So Aristotle, for instance, kind of notoriously thought that the life of rational contemplation was the best life for anyone, period. I've always found it a little bit funny that a philosopher would wind up saying that, wouldn't you know, philosophy turns out to be the best of all possible courses of life. But there you go. For a lot of Catholic theologians, right, religious salvation is the highest end for all human beings. For Bentham, the highest end is, well, it depends, right? The best life is one with the most amount of pleasure for you. And what gives you pleasure kind of depends on what you like. So the best life is going to be different for different people. And as a corollary, right, Bentham thought that the state, the role of government, should be fairly limited in terms of the way in which it imposes or tries to fit all individuals into one unique mold, right? He thought because people vary in what makes them happy, government should let people pursue their bliss basically as they see fit, as long as they're not harming others in doing so. So it's no mistake that John Stuart Mill, who was the author of Utilitarianism, was also the author of the magisterial and classic on liberty. So, there's a lot to be said for Bentham's theory of the good, but there's also a certain, as you may have noticed, narrowness to the view. And that's a narrowness that Mill himself came to recognize more and more as his career progressed. So, in his 1863 work, Utilitarianism, and this is the book that's still required reading in virtually every ethics course taught in the Anglophone world, in that book, Mill still appeared to pledge fidelity to the utilitarian orthodoxy. He writes that pleasure and freedom from pain are the only things desirable as ends, and that all desirable things are desirable either for the pleasure inherent in themselves or as a means to the promotion of pleasure and the prevention of pain. That's just straight ethical hedonism, and it's in the first couple of sentences of the second chapter of Utilitarianism. But you don't have to read much further than those first few sentences to see that there's something a little more complicated going on with Mill. So right after he sets out this view, he starts responding to an objection. It's an objection that had been pressed upon him by Thomas Carlyle. And the objection was that this view, this hedonistic view that really life is simply about pleasure, that's fine for pigs, right? That's, because that's all that pigs got going for them really is pleasure. Rolling around in the mud, eating muck, right? That's it. But for human beings, there should be something more dignified, right? So Carlyle wrote off utilitarianism as what he called a pig philosophy, or a doctrine worthy only of swine. And in response to that, Mill draws this very famous distinction between what he calls higher pleasures and lower pleasures. So the higher pleasures are the pleasures, he says, of the intellect, of the feelings and imagination, and of the moral sentiments, so kind of intellectual pleasures. Whereas lower pleasures are pleasures of sensation, pleasures of the body. And he makes the claim that the higher pleasures are basically categorically superior to the lower order pleasures, such that there's basically no quantity of the lower pleasures that can possibly compensate for the loss of the higher pleasure. And one of his more famous lines, he sums it up this way. He says, it's better to be a human being dissatisfied than a pig satisfied. Better to be Socrates dissatisfied than a fool satisfied. So, a lot can and has been said about this particular distinction that Mill draws, and I'm not going to get too deeply into the textual disputes over what exactly Mill meant here, but one thing is pretty clear, and that's that Mill is rejecting, just categorically rejecting, the simple monism of Benthamite hedonism. Right? He's rejecting the view that there's one thing called pleasure, and all there is to argue about is how much of that pleasure we can achieve. It's all about quantity. He says, no, it's about, there are different qualities of pleasures as well. It's not just about maximizing a simple sum. And that's a smart move on Mill's part. Because once you stop to think about it, I mean, as elegant and reductionist as Bentham's theory might be, it's clearly got to be wrong, right? So if Bentham is right, then pleasure is the measure of everything, and pleasures are fungible, right? They could just be traded off amongst each other. So if you lose a friend, or you fail on some major project that you've undertaken on work, or you lose your pet dog, poor Max, right? Your utility goes down, you're sad. Don't worry about it, because in principle, there's some number of cupcakes that you could eat that would suffice to raise your utility back to the level it was before you lost poor Fido. Or your spouse or your child or anybody, anything else in your life, right? It's pleasure is pleasure, pushpin is as good as poetry, and cupcakes are as good as a friend, or at least a lot of chocolate cupcakes are as good as a friend. That's a fairly crazy view, but it's one that follows pretty directly from the view that there's simply one valuable good, and that all valuable things in the world can be measured and compared on this simple common scale. Another example from utilitarianism. So later in that book, Mill writes, very surprisingly for a utilitarian, that moral virtue, in the Aristotelian sense, is an end in itself. You think, oh, wait a minute, you just told us pleasure is the only thing that's an end in itself. So how can this possibly be? His response is to say this. He says, the ingredients of happiness are very various. Horrible phrase. And he's usually a good writer, but that's Jarvis. And each of them is desirable in itself, and not merely when considered as swelling in aggregate. The principle of utility does not mean that any given pleasure, like music for instance, or any given exemption from pain, such as health, are to be looked upon as a means to a collective something termed happiness, and to be desired on that account. They are desired and desirable for themselves. Besides being means, they are part of the end. So in other words, happiness isn't just one thing, right? Like the Benthamite view might lead one to suppose. There's not some mental sensation, right, called pleasure that is the ultimate end of human action, and the promotion of which is the sole source of value for all other valuable things. Instead, happiness or pleasure is just this label that we use to describe lots of different goods, all of which play some irreducible and ineliminable role in a good life, according to Mill. Friendship is a constituent part of what we mean by happiness, and so is virtue, and so is achievement, and so are lots of other things. This idea of pleasure, in the Benthamite sense of a desirable mental sensation, seems at this point to have dropped out of the analysis pretty much altogether. So, it's difficult to read utilitarianism, let alone Mill's essay on Bentham, which is a terrific reflection and critique of Bentham's thought, and to sustain the interpretation of Mill as an orthodox hedonic utilitarianism. And that I want to suggest, to wrap up, is because he's simply not. So what's going on with Mill? Well, look, Mill drank deeply from the waters of philosophical radicalism from the very day he was born. Everyone he loved, his family, his colleagues, all of it revolved around the figure of Bentham. And so utilitarianism and Benthamite utilitarianism became, for reasons that are quite understandable, a central part of Mill's self-identity. But as he matured, it became more and more impossible for a mind as expansive and as inquisitive as Mill's to remain locked within the confines of utilitarian orthodoxy. His own struggles with depression, his recovery under the influence of the Romantic poets, such as Samuel Taylor Coleridge, his beautiful but ultimately tragic romance with Harriet Taylor. All of these left Mill with, I think, a richer, more nuanced understanding of the human condition than anything his mentor Bentham seems to have ever had. So while Mill remained a faithful throughout his life to the label of utilitarianism, I think in terms of the substance of his view, and especially in terms of his theory of the good, Mill was a utilitarian in name only. At root, I think he was really a kind of romantic Aristotelian, which confirms my hypothesis after Corey's talk that, like, basically everybody, once you penetrate the surface, is an Aristotelian to the extent that they make sense about morality. The world as he saw it contained a multitude of varying and incommensurable goods. And for Mill, this was a source of much of the world's great and ineffable beauty, a beauty that Bentham was largely blind to. It was also, of course, insofar as a plurality of incommensurable goods makes it virtually inevitable that we're going to find ourselves in a situation where those goods come into conflict, a situation where we're forced to choose, and in choosing, sacrifice something of real and irreplaceable value. It's also a source of much of the world's tragedy. But I think the fact that Mill was able to recognize this and to accept the tragedy alongside the beauty is really a mark of Mill's great richness as a thinker.
First, I may start coughing. I've had a chest cold for the last 3 weeks because I'm trying to be in a Victorian novel. Diet consumption. It's not going away, but I won't go to the doctor. So don't feel badly for me. I should. I just don't know what's good for me. That's the first thing. So if that starts happening, that's just that. Secondly, unlike Mill and Kant, who I think a lot of people take seriously, I'm going to talk about Moore, who I think people don't take seriously in his thought about the good or about ethics. And the reason for this is when Brian offered different people to talk about, I didn't really know very much about Moore, and I wanted to learn about him. I trained primarily as an analytic philosopher of language, and we talk about Moore in philosophy of language, and there is an ethical project as well, but sort of no one delves into it, except for to talk about its effects on literary history, which I'll say something about a little bit later. There aren't really any Mooreans. There are Millians, there are Kantians, but no one, yes, G.E. Moore is right about this. So I kind of wanted to know what it is he has to say beyond the one thing everyone sort of knows about him. So what I'm going to say is going to jump around a little bit. I'm going to defend myself by saying that he thought ethics was not systematic, and so it's his fault and not my own fault. It's my fault. Do you work? How do I make you work? I can't make technology work either. So he begins, and I'm going to primarily talk about his view in Principia Ethica, though he develops it a little bit later in Ethics and other works. He talks about the central question in thinking about ethics, which is what is good, and the different ways that that can be asked and answered. So that you could ask me what is good, and I could point to something that is good. That's good. And that's an answer. It's not the kind of answer you want. Or you could give a second kind of answer where I say something like, pleasure is good. Puppies are good. Puppies are very good. Yes, Laurie. Except for when you have two of them and they don't really like each other, as we both know. You can say something like that, but those aren't the kinds of, those are just ostensions. I'm pointing to things that are good. I'm not telling you what good is. And Moore thinks that what philosophers have wanted, what ethicists have wanted, is an account not just of what good things are, but what the definition of good is. And what Moore says about this, and I can finish the talk right after I say this, is that the only thing you can say to define good is that good is good. That's it. What is good? Good. It's simple, he thinks. It's like yellow, in the sense that if you've never experienced yellow, I can't tell you what it is. This is almost a Humean point about the blue you've never seen. I can't explain yellow unless you've had a visual experience of yellow to you. I could talk around it, but I can't really get you to it. And he thinks good is that way as well. It's not analyzable. It's simple. And if you don't know what good is, I can't tell you what good is. And this is where we should stop. But he says a lot more about good. So the first thing is that good is this indefinable simple concept. Now, if it's an indefinable simple concept, and yet we have knowledge about it, we can't get knowledge about it in the way we get other kinds of knowledge. But he doesn't want to go the sort of Humean way where he says that good is just a feeling. He thinks good is a real thing. He's a moral realist. He thinks that there are facts about the good. So we have to know about the good some way. How do we know about the good? Oh, I skipped. I'm sorry, I'm in the wrong order. I can't read my own slides either. We're going to get to how we know that in a second. He's got an argument for this idea that it's simple and indefinable. And this is the thing that he's most famous for. It's his naming of what he calls the naturalistic fallacy and the open question argument that underlies it. Other moral realists, and he is a moral realist, he thinks that there are moral facts, that there are really good things and really not good things, but others have tried to analyze goodness in terms of other properties. So Bentham, it's pleasure, it might be happiness, whatever that means exactly for Mill, it's meeting our end for Aristotle, it's having a good will, you can analyze good in different ways. But, Moore thinks, anytime you give an analysis, there's always a question you can ask. So you tell me that the good is utility, and I can ask, and this is all about tone of voice, but is utility good? And I haven't said something stupid there. It's still an open question whether it's really good, he thinks. This analysis is different than the analysis H2O is water. If you tell me H2O is water, and I say, is it? Then I've done something weird, but I haven't done that weird thing when I say, is it in this case? Or so he thinks. Now there's the paradox of analysis, and all analyses may be like this, but he thinks there's something really interesting here. That when I say utility is good, I'm not saying utility is utility. I'm adding some other thing to it, and that goodness I can't analyze. I can't say what that other thing is, or so Moore thinks. Now we've got this problem, that I know what, supposedly there is a good, and I know what the good is, and I can't analyze it, but I have to have knowledge of it, because he thinks I can cognize the good. How do I do that? Intuition. So he thinks that because the good is not a thing that is analyzable in terms of other properties, I can't infer knowledge of the good from other knowledge. I can't know other things and then have the conclusion, aha, it's good. I've got to know it some other way. No other knowledge could play that role for something that's simple and unanalyzable. In the same way you couldn't argue me into believing that something was yellow if it weren't. You couldn't prove to me that your shirt is yellow if it weren't. I see the yellow. That case is perceptive. There's a different kind of perception. I intuit the goodness. But it's only intuitive, he thinks, in the sense that, and it's kind of weak intuition, it's intuitive in the sense that I can't get to the knowledge of it from any other kind of knowledge. And he thinks I can be wrong about it. I can have bad intuitions about what the good is. He doesn't say much about what that fallibility looks like, but he thinks you can make mistakes. It's not infallible. It's not a priori or anything like that, quite. Well, it is a priori, but not a priori and analytic. And it's not clearly, he thinks, access to some metaphysical world above us or beyond us. So it's not intuition in the Platonic sense, where I can see the world of the forms. It's intuition of only this world, because he thinks there is no metaphysical world beyond this. One other thing about this, he says about goodness, and I'm not going to delve very much into it, it has the same metaphysical status, he says at one point, as numbers. So that should clarify exactly what's meant. No one knows what numbers are. What he says is that they exist but don't have being. And I don't know what that means either, so if you do, tell me later. But they have a role, but they don't have a metaphysical existence outside this world. But one other thing about intuition, when he says that we can intuit what the good is, he means that we can intuit only the good in itself. We can intuit intrinsic goodness. But we cannot intuit duties or obligations. We can't do that either. We can't intuit the rules of ethics. And in fact, in an almost utilitarian way, what he says is all that there is to duty is increasing the number of good things or bring about the most good in the world. So there are ways in which what he ends up saying looks a lot like Mill, even though he really hates the utilitarians. Maybe he's just Aristotle too. Maybe everyone is. So intuition has got to be the key to the knowledge. That should, of course, raise some flags, because intuition is notoriously a bad grounding for any kind of knowledge. And sometimes, though he doesn't say this so much in Principia, he says that we can know what the good is because it's self-evident. And always the question there is, to which self is it evident? It's evident to Cambridge dons of the late 19th and early 20th century. So he's got this idea that we can intuit, and I'm going to say more about how this intuition works or how we can get to it. But one other thing about the good, he talks about good things in terms, first, I'm sorry, when things are good, he thinks they're good non-relationally. He, like Mill, is concerned with, like the utilitarians, is concerned with states of affairs. And he thinks a state of affairs is good intrinsically, not based on its relation to other states of affairs. And this is the example he gives, and see if this helps. That if you had a choice between a beautiful world that no one would ever experience, and an ugly world that no one would ever experience, the beautiful world would be better, even though it's not related to an observer, or so Moore thinks. And he thinks we have that intuition, that even if it were never experienced, it would be better just because it's beautiful. That means that that state of affairs is good intrinsically, independently of whether anyone can observe it, any other state of affairs, as for instance, it's being observed. That's one thing. The second thing that's important for him is that when he talks about goodness, and goodness of a state of affairs, he thinks that a state of affairs can be better or worse than the sum of its parts. That it's not just additive. So an example here, if you think about a beautiful world, or a beautiful object he thinks is intrinsically valuable, it's intrinsically good, but it has a low level of intrinsic goodness. Consciousness might be intrinsically good, it might be indifferent, because you can be conscious of good things and conscious of bad things, and it may be that consciousness made us less happy than we otherwise would have been. But you add them together, beauty and consciousness, you get consciousness of beauty, and there you have a great good, greater than either the beauty itself or consciousness itself. Or to use a slightly different and more mundane example that I was talking to Brian about earlier, I stupidly got a second puppy 7 months ago. The puppy is good, his older brother is good, together, they're not as good. Adding them lowers the value. So he thinks that when you talk about the value of an organic unity, a full state of affairs, it is not just good or bad, just additively out of its parts. You have to look at the goodness of the whole. At some point they'll love each other, or one of them will die. I'm sorry, that was dark. Which is the way I tend to be. So that's part of his idea, and I'm going to come back to the organic unities in a second, because he makes this other move. And he's given a very minimal account of what the good is, but he's going to give an account of what he thinks the highest goods are. And he does this in thinking about what he calls the ideal at the end of the Principia. That we think about ideal states of affairs. And he thinks we think about these in three ways. We sometimes think about the absolute ideal. This would be something like heaven. This is paradise. This is the summum bonum, the best possible thing there could be, the best possible state of affairs. And sometimes when people talk about ideal situations, ideal states of affairs, they mean the absolute. He's not going to talk about that, partly because he doesn't believe in the kingdom of heaven, partly because he thinks that it's not clear that we could even conceive of what the absolutely good would be. Because the absolutely good may remove all sorts of things that we find good here. The absolutely good might be so different that we can't even conceive what it would be like. There's a second way in which people talk about ideals. It's the way people talk about ideals when they talk about the highest human good, when they write novels of utopias, or they talk about, after the revolution, what pure communism will look like. You'll be against the wall. That was a joke. I'm not a communist. Sorry. That's another thing that's interesting, he thinks, but not interesting really to him because he's not doing political philosophy. The third thing that we can mean when we talk about ideal states of affairs, or the ideal, are states of affairs that he thinks are good in themselves to a high degree. And unless we know what things are good in themselves to a high degree, we could not know what a utopia would really be, and we could not know what an absolute would really be. So that's his building block. And that is going to be the bulk of what the rest of what I talk about, are things that he thinks are good to a high degree. Now, we have to somehow intuit what the things are that are good in themselves to a high degree. And he is a pluralist about what the good is. He thinks that there are lots of things that are positive goods, and that we can see that they're positive goods. We can see them intuitively. That's how we do it. But he thinks that there are some goods that are the ideal goods. And he's going to identify exactly two of them, the things that are the most good. And the way you do this is, the way you identify something that's a positive good, he thinks, is you conceive of that thing in isolation. And you ask yourself, this is just intuition, You ask yourself, would this thing existing in isolation from anything else be good? And each will have roughly matching intuitions about this. Intuition's doing a lot of work here, a lot of work it shouldn't be doing. But he thinks he's a common sense philosopher, and he thinks that we have knowledge of what the good is. And it's a common sense that we have of this. So the first thing is you ask yourself, would this thing in isolation, even if no one knew about it, be a good? If it is, it's an intrinsic good, a good in itself, like a beautiful world. But then you can ask yourself, once you've gotten some things that are good in themselves, some intrinsic goods, more things, you can then ask what comparative value those isolated things have. Which things would be even more valuable if they were isolated? Which things come out higher value? Again, intuition doing all the work. And you can see why maybe this didn't end up being a project people took up. But I'll say something that's interesting about it at the end. He doesn't think that when we do this, we would think of freedom or equality, the kind of political values that we tend to have, as being the things that were good in and of themselves in an isolated way. And he says, not much to say about this, but freedom is good primarily instrumentally, because it can get me other things. Equality is good instrumentally. Lots of our political values, the things that we find good in society, are good because they get us other goods. So those can't be the highest goods. Those aren't even, he thinks, intrinsically good. What is intrinsically good? As I said, there are only two of them, are intrinsically good to a high degree, and only two that he really focuses on. And he, as I said, he thinks that he is a common sense philosopher, and so he thinks that the answer he's going to give to the things that are good to the highest degree is a relatively banal answer. So he says in section 113 of Principia, indeed, once the meaning of the question before us, that is, what are the high goods, what are the high positive goods, is clearly understood, the answer to it, in its main outlines, appears to be so obvious that it runs the risk of seeming to be a platitude. We'll see in a second if it's a platitude. By far the most valuable things, which we know or can imagine, are certain states of consciousness, which may roughly be described as the pleasures of human intercourse and the enjoyment of beautiful objects. The two high goods, the things that have the most intrinsic value, he thinks, are human interaction and aesthetic enjoyment. A side note now, of the people who took more seriously, some of the people who took them the most seriously were the Bloomsbury group, people around Virginia Woolf. He was a great inspiration for their thinking about the importance of beauty. What are the two values he has here? Art and love. That's it. Those are the two high ones, he thinks. Those are the two most important ones. Probably not what we would have thought, but those he thinks are the highest positive goods. And when he talks about morality and virtue and duty, he says in the same section, it's only for the sake of these things, that is, for aesthetic enjoyment and human intercourse, in order that as much of them as possible may at some time exist, that anyone can be justified in performing any public or private duty, that they are the raison d'etre of virtue, that is they, these complex wholes themselves and not any constituent or characteristic of them, that form the rational ultimate end of human action and the sole criterion of social progress. These appear to be truths which have been overlooked. Personal affections and aesthetic enjoyments include all the greatest, and by far the greatest, goods we can imagine. It's all art and love. So this is not Aristotle. I want to say a little something about the structure of these, and then I'll wrap up, because we're towards the end. When he talks about aesthetic enjoyment, he thinks, and this is not exactly Aristotelian, but he does think that when I have an aesthetic enjoyment, it includes both my emotion, an aesthetic emotion, and a cognition or a consciousness. So that when there is, this is the idea in which there's an organic unity, an aesthetic enjoyment involves me both recognizing the beauty or the beautiful qualities of an aesthetic object and having a certain kind of response. That response is different. So I have a different response, a different emotional response to Wagner than I do to Beyonce, for instance. Different emotions are appropriate to different beautiful objects or beautiful things. And sometimes those emotions have no value in themselves, or they might make another state of affairs worse. If I listen to Wagner and it gets me really passionate, In other situations, that passion would be bad, like if I'm really passionate at the dog park and yelling at people in a Wagnerian way. That would be bad there. It would make another state of affairs worse, but it makes this one better. But it's not just emotion, he thinks. I also have to see the beauty. I'm sorry, I have to see the beauty, which I do emotionally, but I also have to see the beautiful qualities. I have to see what makes it beautiful. So he says, this kind of, his example here is music. His example is Beethoven's Fifth, I think. If I'm listening to Beethoven's Fifth and it moves me emotionally, but I recognize nothing about the harmony, I don't know how it's working, that I haven't really gotten this. So it's not just an emotional response, it's an intellectual response, which takes sort of my whole being in with it. That is one of, so the person who doesn't cognize, who doesn't see the beautiful qualities, but only feels the beauty, hasn't really gotten the enjoyment. The high value is seeing the beauty and having the emotion. It's intellectual and emotional all together. And if you don't do that, you really haven't gotten it. In fact, he delves into this really a lot, but I don't have to worry about that with us, I think. There are people who enjoy the wrong things, have the wrong emotional responses. Those are errors of taste. He's much more interested in errors of judgment, and I want to say only one kind of thing here. An error of judgment would be something like, I have the right emotional response, where the actual qualities aren't there. Now that's normally bad. I have a response, an emotional response as to beauty when there's no beauty there. But sometimes that is, in fact, a really good thing, he thinks, a really high value, like in imagination. When I imagine, I have an emotional response to qualities that aren't there. I imagine a beautiful object, and I get some of that aesthetic enjoyment. And that, he thinks, as I said, is one of the highest goods there is. Here's the other one. Oh, sorry, 1 second. It appears probable that the beautiful should be defined. So he thinks that there is only one value, though it comes in many different things. Beauty itself should be defined as that of which the admiring contemplation is good in itself. Beauty itself relies on the idea of good. The question whether it's truly beautiful or not depends on the objective question whether the whole in question is or is not truly good, and does not depend on the question whether it would or would not excite particular feelings in particular persons. That's just to point out one important thing, I think. We're doing a 3-year series on truth and beauty and goodness. For him, they are definitely tied. The beautiful relies on the good. And the correct response to it is responding to it when the qualities are actually there. So truth has a role as well. That's one of them. Here's the other one. The other, and this also ends up being aesthetic, the other great high value are pleasures of human intercourse. For him, these are much the same, except for instead of contemplating a piece of music or a piece of art, what I'm doing is contemplating another being. And when I contemplate that other being, I recognize its beauty, so that I recognize, I'm not going to point to anyone because that's always uncomfortable. It's something I've finally learned in class. When I look at a beautiful person, I recognize their beauty, but he thinks, I'm imagining a beautiful person right there. When I do this, I see someone who is in fact beautiful, but also has a great intrinsic value, because I know, I can intuit, that persons existing in isolation are better than there not being persons. So that I see an object that is beautiful, but I also recognize its great intrinsic value. And when I do this, I appreciate not just their corporeal beauty, which he says I do, but I also appreciate their mental qualities. I do that by the way they express themselves physically, but there's a kind of appreciation of the beauty of a person. So this itself is, in a way, aesthetic. It's all aesthetic. I recognize your beauty, I see your beauty, I see the beauty of your mental qualities, and one other way that it's aesthetic, that when I see you as beautiful and having beautiful mental characteristics, what I'm actually seeing is that you have the ability to have the right kinds of aesthetic experiences. That I have towards you all the emotions involved in aesthetic emotion, plus those that are involved in human interaction. And I won't go into this because we're at the end. This itself gets complex because it can have the wrong reactions to people. So that things that look good can, as organic unities, not be so good. I'm going to wrap up, but I'm just going to wrap up by saying this, that in a really kind of strange way, in a way that you can see that this didn't get taken up, what he ends up saying, essentially, is that there's a lot of different goodnesses. There are lots of different good objects. And we can see these for themselves. But the highest of them are in some way aesthetic, that beauty is implicated in the highest of the goods, either in aesthetic contemplation, aesthetic enjoyment, or the way that I recognize the beauty in another person. And two last things. For him, then, there's no real line between aesthetics and ethics. They are the same thing. It's the same value in both of them, just talked about in different ways. Here's the last thing. As I said, there are intuitionists, but no real Moreians. What happens is, after More, you get a bunch of people who just go fully non-cognitivist. That expressivism gets a rise, because if this is all there is to it, it looks like I haven't said very much about it. I haven't said anything about the good. So you're just expressing a reaction to something that you see or experience. I think More is interesting as a cul-de-sac. But cul-de-sacs, mistakes can be interesting. And that's where I'm going to end.
I want to ask a question about Kant. It seems like the goodwill is the ultimate good, in a way, right? But it's dependent on reason. But if reason is fallible, does that mean the goodwill only exists in the highest individuals that has the reason to sustain the goodwill? Or is it still good when it's fallible at a lower level, but it's still good even though it's fallible? How does Kant say that?
Right, so a couple of things. First, I don't know that Kant is going to say that the goodwill is the highest good. I think the highest good is happiness given in proportion to moral worthiness. Second, Kant, so when we talk about rationality or we talk about a goodwill, we're talking about somebody who can universalize maxims, who can sort of formulate a maxim clearly, you know, ask what do I intend to do, why do I intend to do it, whether or not sort of all of humanity can follow that maxim, and then if all of humanity can, you know, act that way if you want, and if all of humanity cannot, then you cannot act that way. And you don't have to be, for Kant, you don't have to be like John Rawls or W.E.B. Du Bois to kind of to universalize maxims. You don't have to be incredibly smart. You don't have to be Immanuel Kant. You just have to be rational enough to universalize maxims. So I think Kant would say, yes, reason in sort of a finite being, which we all are, can still sort of be good enough. We all don't have to have holy wills or you know, wills that would just operate off of the representation of law itself, right, without sort of any constraint of any desire. So I think he's just going to say yes to that for Kant.